revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. One decision, one word, and suddenly an empire crumbles. For Caitlin Clark, revenge wasn't about firing shots on social media or snapping back in interviews. Her revenge was devastatingly simple. She said no. No to Geno Auriemma. No to UConn's legacy. No to the $1 million offer that came crawling back to her years later.
Like I said earlier, they actually had odds that, she was like third or fourth in the betting odds to be MVP of the WNBA. That's such a slap in the face to every WNBA player. It's unbelievable, right?
On the surface, the entire situation looked unbelievable. Who in their right mind would walk away from more than $1 million for only 8 weeks of basketball? But this wasn't just another offer, it was symbolic. That contract represented the lifeline of a man who had once brushed her aside, belittled her, and treated her like she was irrelevant. When Caitlin Clark rejected it, she wasn't simply saying no to money. She was humbling the very man who once thought he could never be humbled. And that's where the frustration of newer fans often shows. They don't always understand the deeper layers of history or context. They just throw around takes without perspective. But this story goes far beyond a paycheck or a stat sheet. It's not about just points, assists, or trophies. It's about power. For decades, Geno Auriemma was seen as the ultimate gatekeeper of women's basketball. He controlled the narrative, deciding who mattered, who would get the spotlight, and who would fade into the background. But then Caitlin Clark changed everything. She didn't chase his approval, she didn't need his storied program, and she didn't rely on his checkbook. She built her empire entirely outside his orbit. And when he finally reached for her, she turned him away with the kind of quiet confidence that sent a clear message: I don't need you, you need me. Every revenge story begins with a mistake, and Geno's wasn't a bad play call or a mismanaged timeout. His mistake was arrogance, blinding, unchecked arrogance. Before Caitlin Clark became the face of the sport, before she sold out arenas and pulled historic TV ratings, she was just a kid with a dream. And she admitted it openly: UConn was the dream school. It was the dynasty, the empire, the program of Diana Taurasi, Maya Moore, and Breanna Stewart, the mountaintop of women's basketball. For a girl growing up in Iowa, nothing felt bigger. And when recruiting season rolled around, the path looked obvious: the most electrifying talent of her generation paired with the greatest recruiter the game had ever known. But then, silence. The call never came. Geno never dialed her number, never called her parents, hardly even sent a message through her AAU coach. For someone known as the greatest recruiter of all time, that silence was deafening. And it wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. The message couldn't have been clearer: she wasn't a priority. His reasoning? UConn already had Paige Bueckers locked in, and he didn't want two-point guards. On the surface, that explanation might have seemed acceptable. But then came the insult. Geno suggested that if Clark had truly wanted to play for UConn, she should have been the one to call him. Think about that. The same coach who built his empire by identifying generational talent years before anyone else didn't think Caitlin Clark was worth his effort, and then blamed a teenager for not chasing him. That wasn't just a recruiting miss. It was flat-out disrespect, and it was the kind of slight you don't forget. So, Clark tucked it away in the back of her mind. If Geno didn't believe in her, she'd go somewhere that did. She chose Iowa, a program without UConn's banners, mystique, or legendary glow. To outsiders, it looked like settling, a consolation prize. But for Clark, it was freedom. At Iowa, she wasn't Paige's backup or Geno's afterthought. She was the centerpiece, the recruit who would carry the program on her shoulders. And from the moment she stepped onto the floor in Iowa City, she rewrote the narrative. Her deep logo threes weren't just buckets, they were declarations. Her sold-out arenas weren't just games, they were proof. Her record-breaking TV ratings weren't lucky breaks, they were receipts. Every basket, every viral highlight, every shattered record was a statement to the world: you missed this. Meanwhile, Geno doubled down. Instead of humbling himself, he leaned even harder on arrogance. Rather than acknowledging her as a generational force, he tried to diminish her with backhanded remarks, once brushing her off as a kid playing like she's in the driveway. Instead of recognition, he offered condescension. But here's the truth: ordinary players don't sell out Madison Square Garden. Ordinary players don't drag the WNBA into mainstream relevance. And ordinary players don't cost you millions. The irony cuts deep. When Caitlin Clark came knocking, Geno slammed the door. He thought she'd fade into obscurity, another talented player lost to time. Instead, she built the biggest empire women's basketball had ever seen, without him. And when he finally circled back, contract in hand, Clark didn't rage or boast. She simply said one word: no. That rejection hurt him more than any championship loss ever could. But Geno couldn't help himself. Anytime Caitlin Clark's name surfaced, he twisted it back to Paige Bueckers. If Clark was fearless, well, Paige was too. If Clark was connecting with fans, so had Paige. This wasn't random, it was deliberate strategy. By tying Clark's success to his chosen stars, Geno tried to keep himself at the center of the story. He wanted people to think her rise wasn't something separate or new, but just another extension of his dynasty. Yet the cracks began to show. Those backhanded compliments grew old, and people noticed. Fans noticed. Analysts noticed. Coaches noticed. They saw through the act. Caitlin Clark's brilliance didn't need qualifiers. She was breaking attendance records, drawing viewership numbers bigger than most professional franchises, and completely transforming the conversation around women's basketball. Meanwhile, Geno was still clinging to the spotlight, smiling for cameras while his insecurity seeped through. Eventually, the mask slipped. Subtle digs weren't enough anymore. Geno escalated from undermining Clark to outright attacking her fans. For months, he had disguised shade as commentary, but in June 2024, during an interview on The Dan Patrick Show, he crossed a line he could never return from. The Hall of Fame coach, the supposed pinnacle of women's basketball leadership, didn't just question Clark. He attacked the very people who supported her. His rant was blunt and vicious. He called her fan base delusional. He claimed they didn't understand the game. And then, in a shocking leap, he said they were so ignorant that they were damaging women's basketball itself. Their crime? Believing Caitlin Clark could finish in the top 4 of MVP voting as a rookie. To Geno, that wasn't optimism, it was stupidity. Even Diana Taurasi joined in with a jab, saying, "This kid's in for a rude awakening." But think about what was really happening. Millions of new fans were pouring into women's basketball because of Clark. Families were showing up in jerseys. Kids were camping outside arenas just to catch a glimpse of her. Casual sports fans were tuning into WNBA broadcasts for the very first time. And Geno's response? Not gratitude. Not celebration. Insult. Instead of embracing the new wave of excitement, he mocked it. His words weren't analysis. They weren't about basketball strategy. They were personal attacks aimed at the heartbeat of Clark's movement, the fans who had carried women's basketball into the national spotlight. And because of who he was, those words carried weight. They weren't just dismissive, they were damaging. By calling her fans clueless, Geno wasn't just underestimating them, he was underestimating her.